Chapter 6. You are quiet, compassionate space in which the life that you think of as yourself unfolds. Time. One instant is eternity. Eternity is the now. When you see through this one instant, you see through the one who sees. Wu Men. The basic misunderstanding, the essential endarkenment, is the belief in discrete individuals existing as separate entities, and as the originators, thinkers, or doers of any thoughts, actions, or experiences, including, of course, the presumed individual thinking this. It is not so very difficult to understand, at least intellectually, that this universe is a dream, but it is almost impossible to accept that the one who is supposed to understand this is himself part of the dream. This belief in oneself is the only obstruction to the happening of apperception. Ramesh. This belief in separate individuals, including the individual which one calls oneself, is part of the larger illusion of space-time. All there is consciousness, presence, noumenon. What is perceived as the manifestation, phenomenon, the totality of space-time, is an appearance in consciousness and not other than it. It is not terribly difficult or unusual for seekers after some investigation to be able to intellectually comprehend the illusory nature of the individual and of separation. Both are functions of the idea of space. It is in space that things, including individuals, appear to be distinct and separate from each other. While it is indeed another matter to include one's own self in this, nevertheless the basic idea can be grasped. After all, the central idea that all is one is present in almost all the world religions and spiritual traditions, and is one which any spiritual seeker will have been exposed to for some time. As I have said, the idea that we are one is self-contradictory and clouded in fuzzy thinking. But again, nevertheless, the basic principle can be understood. The principle of boundaries which creates separation in space into distinct individual entities is illusion. In truth, only oneness is. When this is spoken of in a group of seekers, there can be seen a general nodding of heads. Of course, this presents its own dilemma. While this principle of spatial oneness, the illusory nature of the separation of all things in space, is in some circles so familiar as to be a truism, it is clearly not truly and fully understood. True understanding of this would bring the end to all questions, suffering, and seeking. When one moves on to the concept of the illusory nature of time and begins to talk of temporal oneness, there is not this familiarity, and even intellectual comprehension is much harder to come by. Phrases like, "there is no such thing as time," or "there is no past or future, only now," can be repeated easily, but any understanding as to what this means is less common. The bookstores are full of books propounding the value of living in the now. One popular author insists that there is no past or future, but only now, the present moment. At any given time, there exists only the present moment. There is always only now and now and now. Each present moment is followed by the next present moment. More fuzzy thinking. This is merely renaming the past, present, and future, somewhat confusingly as now, now, and now. There is still the concept of sequential time. one present moment following another. Perhaps it can be useful to use the model of spatial oneness, which, once it is understood, at least intellectually, exposes the illusion of space, to come to an understanding of temporal oneness, which will in a similar way expose the illusory nature of time. The concepts are parallel. The idea of discrete separate moments in time is like the belief in discrete separate individuals in space. Just as the separate entities in space are seen not to exist as such, as separate entities, but rather simply as appearances in consciousness, or as the way presence manifests, so the separate moments in time can be seen not to exist as such, as sequential moments, but rather simply as appearances in consciousness, or as the way present manifests. There are no separate entities, only what can be called this. There are no separate moments, only what can be called now. There are no individual entities relating to one another. There is only one presence, and it is all. There are no individual moments following one another. There is only one present, and it is eternal. Put another way, just as there is only one presence, present, so there is only one present, presence. I'm not sure this can be arrived at intellectually. With the understanding, the conundrum of time finally simply folds in on itself. The clear understanding that there is no time, of how there is no time, of how time is not, is blindingly simple and obvious, just like the other. Just as there is one presence, so there is one present. And yet even this method of explaining temporal oneness by comparing to spatial oneness is false. These are not other, not two. Of course, they are a single point, infinite, eternal. One infinite presence is one eternal present. There is no thing called presence, which is being present. There is not really this and now. They are the same. The suchness, the isness of this, now. In essence, the illusion of time is exactly the same as the illusion of space, which is exactly the same as the illusion of the individual self. They are part of each other, depend on each other, and prop each other up to form samsara, the objective manifestation brought about through the agency of perception. That is why the illusion of the individual self, or even simply the illusion of the self as an individual doer of anything, can be used as a focal point toward the understanding. When this illusion dissolves, the illusions of space and time go with it. Ramana Maharshi spoke about this connection. What is eternal is not recognized as such owing to ignorance. Ignorance is the obstruction. Get rid of it and all will be well. This ignorance is identical with the I thought. Seek its source, and it will vanish. And Wei Wu Wei expresses the same thought in posthumous pieces. Ignorance of what is eternal is due to the concept of time. The I concept and the time concept are inseparable. Neither can appear to exist without the other. They are dual aspects of what is erroneously conceived as objective. Thus, we return to the central idea becoming clear on the issue of subject-object. The belief in the individual self is an identification as that self as subject, which, through its perceptions, objectifies the rest of the phenomenal universe of space and time. When it is realized that this usurpation of the role of subjectivity is false, that the so-called individual exists not as a subject perceiving, but as merely one of the objects appearing in the phenomenon of space and time, then the illusory or dream nature of all such objects and all of space and time can be seen, with the realization that there is nobody home. The consequent liberation is not only from who, but also from where and from when the supposed phenomenal object has ceased to believe in the impossible, and knows at last that he has always been, and what the phenomenal universe has always been, which knows no who, no where, no when. Wei Wu Wei. Then one looks a little differently at the New Age slogan popularized by Ram Dass, "Be here now." On the level at which it was intended, it works well as a reminder to mindfulness. Although even there it begs the basic question, who is to be here now? But in the understanding, all three words are seen to be redundant. All there is being. There is only here. There is nothing other than now. Where else can I possibly be but here, now? Even if there is being lost in a memory of the past, that past exists only as that memory, that thought, happening now, here. Even when there is worrying about the future or daydreaming happening in a body-mind organism, that worrying or daydreaming is what is happening in that organism here, now. There can never be anything other than being here, now. There is only here, and it is all unbounded, undivided. There is only now, and it is eternal, unbounded, undivided. So relax. There is no effort needed to be here now. You cannot not be. Enjoy. Subject-object. From within or from behind, a light shines through us upon things and makes us aware that we are nothing, but the light is all. R. W. Emerson. Music heard so deeply that it is not heard at all, but you are the music while the music lasts. T. S. Eliot. Be clear who is subject and who or what is the object. This may sound a little academic, but stay with me here. This is key. Our language betrays us. Every time we speak, even when we speak of the understanding of all that is, we do so by constructing sentences like this one, which are pure idiocy. Look at what that sentence does. It sets up all that is as the object about which we, the subject, are speaking. All that is, pure subjectivity, that in which all objects arise and which as such cannot be an object of anything, and we, body-mind organisms, and as such human objects among other objects, usurping the role of subject, completely inverted. But it is how our whole language and thought structure are constructed. With the understanding, it is seen so clearly how ironic this is. That is the streaming of this very consciousness itself through these limited human objects, which is what gives them the ability to erroneously think that they are separate consciousnesses, which is what allows these objects to arrogate for themselves the role of pseudo-subject. Sometimes, in the case of some body-mind objects, there is a moment on the way to the understanding where there is a subtle but vital distinction to be made, and it can be easily missed. At some point in the intellectual understanding of the teaching, it becomes clear that all there is consciousness. If so, then there is nothing which is not consciousness. If so, then even this which is realizing this consciousness. If one has been exposed to Advaitic teaching, in particular if one has read Nisargadatta Maharaj, or even if not, the phrase I am that will suddenly take on great significance. Be clear who is subject and who or what is the object. On the threshold of awakening, on the eve of the annihilation of the false self, the ego will seek to save itself by this subtle misdirection. Of course, I understand and accept that I am not an individual self, but what I truly am is consciousness, all that is. I am that, I am God. One does not have to look far to find teachers who have gone down this road convinced they have reached awakening, God consciousness. There is unavoidably a subtleness that is sometimes lost in the translation and transcription of Maharaj's talks. The ancient Sanskrit phrase, which parallels Maharaj's I am that, is Tattvam Asi, literally, that thou art, which preserves that as the subject. That subject is what you, object, are. Maharaj's native Marathi has a similar language structure, and a truer translation of Maharaj's sense could be, that is what the I is. I am that. There is a sense in which this is true. In one in whom the understanding has truly happened, this can be said with impunity. Although then there will be no need for it to be said, and little interest in doing so. Then there is no longer any identification as the separate doer, the separate entity, the small self, the egoic I. But until then, and especially when one is advanced in the intellectual understanding of the teaching, there is a short circuit that can happen here. Do yourself a favor and don't go there. I assure you, as long as there is an I, to say I am that I is the ego. As Ramana Maharshi would say, wrong I. Remove the word am, and the identification of the I as a separate ego is deflated. That is what the I is. Gets the perspective right, keeps it clear who is subject and who or what is the object. There is nothing wrong, nothing amiss in all this. It is all the perfect unfolding of totality in consciousness. All there is consciousness. All this happens in consciousness, so it can be said that it is consciousness itself, which identifies as the body-mind organisms. Even the basic misperception, the usurpation of subjectivity by the object instruments, is not some wrong thing being done that needs to be corrected. The identification as an object is simply what is happening in consciousness, and it results in what we are calling the dream. When awakening from the dream occurs in the case of the body-mind object, there is the ceasing or falling away of that identification as a pseudo-subject, and that too is simply what is happening in consciousness. When the understanding occurs and there is that falling away of identification, then there is the end also to the whole subject-object distinction. It is seen that there is no relationship, no I and thou, for they are the same. I, as separate pseudo-subject, has never existed, and thou is not other, is who I always already is. The first teacher I heard talking about Advaita made a useful distinction. She is British, so at first I thought it was just a peculiarity since the British frequently use prepositions in a way which is different from the way they are used in America. Or different too, as they would say. But the distinction can be helpful in any case. As concepts, there is a difference between identifying as and identifying with. As, in this context, is like an equal sign. When there is identification as a body-mind object, you believe you are that body-mind. You identify yourself as being that body-mind. But identification with is more like what you mean when you say you really identify with a friend who is going through some experience. You don't think you are your friend, but still you can identify with that, as we say. There is an empathy there, a seeing things through the eyes of your friend. In the dream, there is identification as a body-mind organism. Almost all the dream characters think they are that particular body-mind with their own separate consciousness and self. This is the usurping of the role of subject, identifying as. When the understanding occurs, this falls away, and what remains is an identification with a body-mind organism. You know this body-mind is not who you are. It is only an object in the consciousness which the I is. But the body-mind organism continues to function, and there is an experiencing of life through the eyes of that body-mind organism. This is identifying with. Teachers of Advaita sometimes use the image of a chauffeur. Because he has access to a nice car and can drive it anywhere, the chauffeur can be deceived into thinking that it is his car, thus arrogating subjectivity. With the understanding there is no chauffeur, only an owner-driver who is very aware of the different functions involved in owning a car and driving one. An impossible weight. A person is not a thing or a process, but an opening through which the Absolute manifests. Martin Heidegger. God only knows. God makes his plan. The information's unavailable to the mortal man. Paul Simon. The entire difficulty could be summed up like this. The human object has bitten off more than it can chew, taken on more than it is capable of. Armed with just enough of the consciousness flowing through it to give it just enough intelligence to facilitate a function it calls thought. The human being believes his or herself to be a separate, independent being, autonomous in itself, having the responsibility of freedom and of choice in its decisions and actions. But you see, it isn't. The so-called human being is only an object in consciousness, however much it believes itself to be an independent conscious being, however much it attempts unwittingly to usurp the role of subject. How can an object in the play of consciousness, with the entirely limited capacity of an object, a dream character, a character in a movie, not be completely overwhelmed if it attempts to take on the role and responsibilities of subject, of the dreamer, of the scriptwriter and producer and director of the movie? The human character convinces itself that it has almost complete freedom, and therefore responsibility for its actions. It then finds itself nevertheless doing what it is intended to do in the perfect unfolding in the infinite expression of consciousness, playing its role as it has been scripted. But I didn't mean to do that. I try to be a better person, but I still find myself acting this way. This didn't happen the way I intended. I keep doing this. Why can't I learn? So much energy is spent berating oneself for not living up to what one has become convinced he or she should be. So much guilt, and an equal amount of energy expended trying to avoid that guilt by faulting someone else for not living up to the same expectations. It's ridiculous. The human organism thinks it's God and takes on the responsibilities of God, but has only the capacity of a created object. No wonder so many feel so bad about themselves so much of the time. How can they possibly measure up? It's an impossible setup. and the suffering that the human object brings upon himself by taking on the role of subject is in fact imaginary and unnecessary. It's a massive case of confused and mistaken identity. The whole idea that there is such a thing as an individual, a self, a person, a human being, is simply a small, innocent mistake. There seems to be all this activity, thoughts, emotions, what writers call a stream of consciousness, which gives the illusion of a certain continuity. It is this apparent continuity of brain activity which you think of as yourself, but in fact, it doesn't exist. There's no thing there. Who you think you are, a human being, is actually much less. A dream character, an apparent body-mind organism functioning as a pass-through mechanism in the expression of consciousness. But who you really are is actually immeasurably more. And all of this, including the life of the body-mind thing you think you are, is in truth unfolding perfectly, flawlessly, in the pure choiceless awareness that you truly are. If the dream is the result of divine hypnosis, why isn't the hypnosis complete? Why does anyone wake up? The understanding is total grace, complete gift. That it should happen at all, that any should awaken in the dream, is a great mystery. The ego does not get put aside without a struggle. We do not give up our lives easily. The truth is that left to our own devices, we would not give up at all. What does it take to realize that the self that we have constructed since we were born is not real, does not exist? Sometimes it takes some pretty drastic measures. Intense physical and mental distress, often to the edge of bodily death, seems to frequently be a factor in accounts of awakening. Not that that's much help, I suppose. But after awakening occurs, all this is seen in a kind of inverse way. Whatever it takes to break your heart open and wake you up, that is grace. Here you are, and it all is what it is. It unfolds perfectly. Does psychology or therapy have any place in this process of waking up? It's interesting that you use that word, because that's the difference. Therapy is a process, something the dream characters go through here, in the dream. Process and growth and becoming only happen in duality. Such is the nature of duality. Awakening is not a process. It is popping out of the context of process, out of duality. But in retrospect, it can be seen that psychotherapy can certainly serve a purpose in stabilizing a sense of self to the point where it becomes safe, or even possible, to let it go. A very insecure and defensive ego with very low self-esteem or full of fear and anxiety will only be further affronted or hurt by being told that it doesn't really exist, that it is only a false imagination, a mistaken idea that needs to be annihilated. Ironically, it takes a fairly strong ego to be able to hear this message and entertain the idea. But dragging back and forth over the emotional coals of past events in therapy can be a pretty rugged ordeal, and after a point completely counterproductive if you get to taking it too seriously. From the present perspective, it's clear that it is futile to try to know or find out who one is. That's just chasing after the wind. The individual self, which psychotherapy is designed to help, in fact, is an illusion, and that is the whole problem. The crucial insight is in seeing who or what one is not, and psychotherapy is not likely to take you there. But before awakening or after awakening, the body-mind organism continues to operate as it is programmed and conditioned. And so it is always helpful to know where one's psychological blind spots are. Simply learning what and where these are, without trying to fix them, can be extremely helpful. But beyond that, there's not much point working on the ego, or for that matter, working to diminish the ego, since it is only a hologram or illusion which doesn't actually exist on its own merits. Throughout Ramana Maharshi's teaching is the theme that since the ego has no real existence of its own, it disappears or vanishes when the light of inquiry is brought to it. What you are left with, when the falseness of the ego vanishes, is truth. It's that simple. That's what waking up is. Reality is simply loss of the ego. It seems like a lot of people are unhappy, and therapy, different kinds of therapy, can help that. Well, sure, that's what's available. Dream characters are unhappy, so they go to therapy in the dream, so they feel happier in the dream. It's a closed system. There are also other ways in the dream to feel happier. But essentially, in case you haven't noticed, unhappiness is inherent in the dream. It's how duality works, and there will be relative happiness and relative unhappiness as long as there is bondage to the terms of the dream. In practical terms, 9/10 or more of the perceived problem, this so-called bondage, or more practically unhappiness, has to do with the concept of responsibility. People do love the concept of free will, go to the block for it, believe life isn't worth living without it. But a consistent examination reveals that it is only an idea, not your actual experience at any point. Causation is so complex that there is no way you can truly say free will has any meaningful input into any action performed by the mind-body you call yourself. Can you actually find one action which you can be sure, which you can prove was yours alone, or yours significantly, or even yours at all, and not the result of the interconnected net of influences of genetics, environment, training, culture, conditioning, historical accident, chance encounter, and so on? Ultimately, you cannot. Once this is understood, it is possible to see that what we think of as individuals are not subjects, not points of origin, but are objects, instruments through which consciousness, cosmic force, divine energy works or flows. The concept of responsibility then pretty much relaxes and goes away. You are no more responsible for what occurs through the mind-body you call yourself. Then the flute is responsible for the music played on it by the musician. Then there is the realization that this is also true of any other mind-body. And so, of course, responsibilities spawn. Guilt, sin, shame, pride, arrogance, malice, all pretty much go out the window. You don't do things, nor does anyone else. Events happen, and they happen through mind, body, organisms as instruments, including the one you call yourself. Well, I'm not sure I can really accept that there's no personal responsibility, but I can see that what you're describing would be a big relief. It is an impossible weight for the object, the instrument, to try to take on the load of being the determiner, the subject, the one responsible, the one apparently screwing up and making a mess of things. It's essentially crazy making, as you can see by looking at the world. The only reasonable, happy, and sane people are the ones who embrace some version of acceptance of what is, as the unfolding in consciousness, even if it takes the form of a somewhat simple faith such as let go and let God. The folks who are convinced they can and have to determine things for themselves with all the attendant implications of personal responsibility are the ones who dig themselves in pretty deep. And yes, of course, taking personal responsibility is a more mature understanding than faulting and blaming everyone else. And so it is taught as a useful strategy for societies and for individuals in the dream. But ultimately, this too is seen to be as empty a concept as the concept of the individual on which it is based. There's a lot of letting go in this. The core, central, irreducible teaching, said in some form by any teacher worth listening to, is all contained in the one line from Hebrew Scripture: "Be still, and know I am God." There's nothing really to teach. If one would only be still, all that can be known is here. All else is dream stuff. All else is just making noise. All else is bondage. But even letting go or being still seems like something I struggle with trying to do. And the teaching I've heard is that you can't do anything. The idea of non-doership is essentially a fairly simple one, but nevertheless it is difficult to talk or even think about it clearly at first, because our language and concepts aren't set up for it. The Chinese have a phrase, "Wei wu wei." Wei is action, wu is the negative, so wu wei is non-action. That gives the basic duality, action or not action. But then there's this experienced alternative of wei wu wei, which is action, which is not action. Neither sitting doing nothing nor running around trying to accomplish things, but the experience of the necessary action happening. The key is in the idea of who is doing the acting. Nobody is. The acting is happening without a doer. This is what our language and concepts have trouble with. My mind has trouble wrapping itself around it. Whose mind? What mind? The you that you think has a mind is an illusion, an idea that we are all taught to believe in, but which turns out to have no basis and no reality. This becomes clear. When you look at it, there isn't really any mind. What is the mind? There is no such separate thing. What there is, what we all experience, is an apparently more or less continuous stream of thoughts. This is what we then call mind, believing that this stream of thoughts is generated from inside our skulls. This is what we have been taught to believe since day one. But look at your experience. Actually, you know that your thoughts come from elsewhere. Sometimes we say, I wonder where that idea came from. Where they all come from. Consciousness, source. The human mind, body, instruments are not points of origin. They are not transmitters. They are only relay stations, pass-through mechanisms for consciousness, which is where the teaching, you are not the doer, comes from. You cannot be a doer of anything. Things happen through the body-mind organism you think of as you. If I am not the doer of any action, who is? If you need to, you can think about things as being done by consciousness through the instruments of the body-mind organisms. But ultimately, that too is a projection of consciousness as a being, an entity like God who does things. Often it is said it is consciousness or presence or love, or the beloved, doing or thinking or experiencing. It can be comforting or inspiring to talk this way, but this is a poetic use of language and concepts. Ultimately, the idea of any doer is let go of. Finally, there is no doer and no thing done, only the doing. No experiencer and no experience. Only the experiencing. And that is what consciousness is. Consciousness doesn't do anything. It is everything. It is all thoroughly and completely impersonal, both in terms of there being any person here as a me, and in terms of there being any divine person. This is the essence of non-duality. There is only all that is. That is what I am. There is nothing other than this, either as me, here, or a God somewhere else. All is I. Here, listen to Wei Wu Wei. All said and done, everything is I and I am no thing. All phenomena are objective manifestations. What I am objectively is the totality of phenomenal manifestation. What I am subjectively is all that all phenomena are. Nothing personal about it anywhere or at any stage. The personal notion is not inherent, and is the whole trouble. It sounds a little scary. Actually, I might lose my mind. You don't have a mind to lose. You'll just lose the mistaken idea that you have one. But scary, yes. That's the ego, the sense of being an individual self, reasserting itself and not wanting to go where it isn't in charge anymore. That's why I say sometimes that left to our own devices, no one would choose this. The ego can't choose its own annihilation. Fortunately, it's not up to you. We've all been conditioned to get scared at this point and worry about going insane. When you step beyond the boundaries of the almost universally accepted perimeters of the dream, of consensus reality, and thoughts happen that are really outside the box, outside of Plato's cave, then it is quite possible there may be some experience of psychological pain or turbulence. And also, everyone else still in the dream is going to think you are pretty weird. But trust me, the place that is really insane is where you are now, believing you are separate, not knowing your true nature, thinking you are this thing, not realizing you are all that is, the pure, choiceless awareness in which all this appears, being, consciousness, bliss, outpouring. A splinter. The crows assert that a single crow could destroy the heavens. This is certainly true, but it proves nothing against the heavens, because heaven means precisely the impossibility of crows. Franz Kafka. A few lines of dialogue from the movie The Matrix. Morpheus. I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice tumbling down the rabbit hole. Neo. You could say that. I can see it in your eyes. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Do you believe in fate, Neo? No. Why not? Because I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life. I know exactly what you mean. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You've felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about? The Matrix? Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us, even now in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth. What truth? that you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch, a prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. Have you ever had a dream, Neo, that you were so sure was real? What if you were unable to wake from that dream? How would you know the difference between the dream world and the real world? This isn't real? What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain. I know what you're trying to do. I'm trying to free your mind, Neo, but I can only show you the door. You're the one who has to walk through it. For the past few years, I've been going around telling friends, acquaintances, people I came across in my shamanic travels, even my therapist, which was a little dangerous, that reality was not what it pretended to be. I said that the whole structure of reality seemed very fishy to me, like it was phony, rigged, set up. I would have moments when I would stop in my tracks. Whatever I was doing, the feeling was so strong. What do you know? You can't explain, but you feel it. You've felt it your entire life, and there's something wrong with the world, like a feeling of déjà vu. Except that this was a feeling that I almost saw something, almost saw through the hologram, the pretense of what we called the real world. There was a frustration because it never quite happened. It remained elusive, a splinter in my mind. This feeling came most strongly when I read about some new scientific discovery, a new galaxy out there where they had looked before and had never seen anything. The astronomer interviewed said they must have overlooked it before. Or a new subatomic particle to join the mesons and gluons and quarks. Somehow these things just kept appearing. I couldn't help but feel, yeah, you're right. Too convenient. What I told my shrink was that I was becoming convinced that somehow we were making it all up as we went along. I couldn't explain how or why, but the whole thing just did not make sense, did not add up, did not stand up to skeptical scrutiny. Too many exceptions to every rule. Too many unexplained events and effects that everyone, scientists and doctors and theologians and teachers and sales clerks and carpet salesmen alike all tried to disregard and shrug off and feebly explain away. It was this splinter in my mind that had me dabbling around in shamanism, doing weird things in the company of tribal medicine men in the middle of the Amazon rainforest, playing around on those edges of how do you define real. When I fell off, when I finally saw what I had been seeing, the truth, who you are, what really is always here, has always been here. It is not something new you have to learn. It is actually completely and totally familiar to us, even though we are not conscious of realizing it. This is the shock of recognition when it occurs. Complete familiarity. Of course, this has always been. More than familiar. This truth is what is most intimate to you. More familiar and intimate than anything that you think or believe or know about yourself. Because these things turn out to be constructs, beliefs, an added layer, outside the most intimate truth which you have convinced yourself that you don't know. But you do. Go back. It is your own self. Once, when I was in Bombay, I found myself one afternoon in a remarkable little hole-in-the-wall shop in the old fort section of the city. Dark, dingy, ancient, the shop specialized in all types of Indian handcrafts. The owner met me at the door with the classic Eastern hospitality of a merchant for a prospective customer. I was offered a seat, a cup of hot chai. and he and his assistants proceeded to bring out and parade before me sandalwood carvings, bronze castings, statues, rugs, silk scarves, jewelry, furniture, boxes, chests, figurines, paintings, gods, goddesses, Buddhas. A particular specialty of the house was the carved wooden screens that are used as room dividers. Composed of several panels, each about 1.5 feet wide by 6 feet high. 4 or 5 of these panels hinged together. One after another, these carved teakwood screens were unfolded in front of me, and they were dazzling. Every inch of every panel was intricately carved, and it was pierced carving, cutting right through the inch-thick wood so that the air could pass through the panels, which of course is why they are called screens. As I examined the carving on one screen, I found that the closer I looked, the more I saw. It was amazing. There were elephant caravans, the palace of Raj, tigers in the jungle, the great river Ganga, sadhus, temples, naked women, processions, the whole life of the Buddha, the myth of Lord Ganesha, Prince Arjuna in battle, more naked women, Shiva dancing the world into existence, and on, the whole history of India, of the world, of the universe. The carving was marvelous. The fringe on the carpets on the elephants' backs was detailed. The naked women were detailed. No individual image on the screen was more than a couple inches high, and this went on for several square feet. The carved screen had my complete and undivided attention for some time. Eventually, around the edges of that concentration, I started to become aware of something else, something going on, that I had on some level been aware of but not been paying attention to. The shop owner and his helpers were still at work, running around, hauling out stuff. And also we have, for you special price, please sir, if you would look at this. I was sitting on the chair, still holding half a cup of sweet tea, leaning forward toward the screen standing a couple of feet in front of me, scanning the marvelous carved landscape, when, pop, my focus changed, and I was suddenly looking through the screen. In fact, the screen and its carved universe, which had occupied all my attention, was suddenly vague and fuzzy, semi-transparent. I was seeing through it, past it, to, well, here the analogy breaks down, because what I was seeing through, too, was the rest of the shop, with its enthusiastic staff piling up rosewood elephants and brass engravings. But nevertheless, pop, a very simple thing, a very ordinary thing. The suddenness of seeing through the veil, to the background, the substrate, to what is always there, and ultimately real and true, but not perceived because our focus has been on the propped-up artificial screen, on the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth, a prison for your mind. What is always there, what is, who you truly are, is precisely the background, the milieu, in which the phony hologram, the matrix, the Maya, exists. Back when I was in seminary, studying theology, there was a Christian theologian, Paul Tillich, perhaps, who was rocking the boat by pointing toward God, not in personal terms, but in terms of the ground of our being. The background, the substrate, Teilhard Chardin's milieu divin, in which all this other stuff, including science and philosophy and gods and trees and thoughts and people and mountains, all appear to exist. You have the look of a man who accepts what he sees because he is expecting to wake up. Ironically, this is not far from the truth. Who you really are knows you are asleep and is expecting to wake up. But no amount of teaching or learning or talking or listening or trying or practicing can bring this about. This is the teaching of all the masters and my experience as well. No one can be told what the matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. The pop of the change of focus cannot be taught. It cannot even be done. It has to happen. This is the consistent message of mystics from all traditions. One can storm the gates of heaven, but there is no guarantee, no formula, no practice that will ensure that they will open. For that there is only unearned grace, and a willingness to be surprised by joy, to be gifted with utter emptiness of self, with a being consciousness bliss that you already are. Listen, among human beings it is said that any individual human being can attain enlightenment. Now, within the context in which it is said, this is undoubtedly true. However, it tells you absolutely nothing about the enlightenment, because enlightenment means precisely the impossibility of the existence of any individual human being. Still expanse. It is utter stillness. Such is the form and shape of your original mind. Your own nature is essentially pure and utterly still. Hui Hai. Mind is Buddha. No mind, no Buddha. Basho. The ultimate understanding is a seeing and a knowing rather than a comprehending. And it does satisfy all questions, though not answer them. Answers become irrelevant, as the questions themselves both cease in the seeing. Do not judge the questioning or the longing, the seeking or the sadness, the impatience or the resistance, the opening or the letting go. It is all the perfect unfolding as it is. Only watch it, and know you are not that. You are loving awareness in which all this arises. You are quiet, compassionate space in which the life that you think of as yourself unfolds. This still expanse of acceptance between the thoughts is all that is. That is what you are. Let the love that is this stillness that you are embrace you, overcome you. Svaha. Peripheral vision. When someone asks me who they are or what God is, I smile inside and whisper to the light. There you go again, pretending. Adyashanti. Perhaps a reason that the understanding is not a more common occurrence is that it is too simple, too close to home, too subtle. All the seeking is in the other direction, towards something other, something grander. Consider this. A common response when the understanding happens is laughter. A common response is, oh, that. Right here. That which is most familiar to you, but overlooked because the looking has been for something else, something beyond. That's why the finding is in stopping, in stillness. Be still and know I am God. Your natural state. Subtle. It is lost, overlooked. If there is positive movement, direct searching, active thinking, anything but profound stillness. A metaphor. In the retina of your eye, there are two kinds of cells, cone cells and rod cells. The cones are clustered toward the center of the retina. What is in the center of your field of view is focused on them, and they register shades of light and especially color. The rods are more numerous around the edge of the retina, and they pick up what is on the edge of your field of view, in your peripheral vision. They do not distinguish color, can discern only black and white, but pick out contrast better than the cones. This is why the rod cells are important for night vision, and explains an odd phenomenon, that night vision is better in your peripheral vision. Walking in the Vermont woods at night, I learned at a young age that what you could make out in the darkness, what you could see, depended on how you looked. Repeatedly you would see a movement in your peripheral vision and turn to look directly at it to see only darkness. Eventually one learns not to turn, not to look directly, but to keep it just in your peripheral vision, just at the point where you are almost not looking at it at all. That is when you can see it best. Subtle. It is lost, overlooked if there is a positive movement, direct searching, active thinking, anything but profound stillness. Focus on it, and it is gone. All of the asking questions, reading books, meditating, thinking, focusing, seeking is all counterproductive because it is pushing in the wrong direction, creating activity and turbulence and noise, just as there is wei wu wei, the action which is not action, action which is not willed, is not volitional but witnessed as spontaneously happening. So too there is a seeing which is not seeing, a seeing which happens without trying, without looking. Asleep in the dream, the everyday activity is to look without truly seeing. What is called for is seeing without looking, the seeing happening without there being one who looks. The poetry of Rumi, Hafiz, of Kabir, and Tagore is all about this sideways seeing, creating a still, quiet openness where the subtleness which would be missed in direct seeking can present itself. Don't wish for union. There's a closeness beyond that. Fall in love in such a way that it frees you from any connecting. Love is the soul's light, the taste of morning. No me, no we, no claim of being. As eyes in silence, tears face, love cannot be said. Rumi. Cannot be said because saying is looking directly. It's the observer principle in reverse. Your true nature. What is pure subjective awareness. So become an observer to try to find it, try to look at it, try to turn it into an object, and you will not see it anywhere, because as an object it is not. Pure awareness, in which everything arises, is what you already are. How can it possibly be found? In stillness this is known. The sheer enormity of the misperception, the misunderstanding is staggering. That's why the laughter when there is finally seeing. It's not like we're even close. Almost the entire human endeavor, from daily life, daily thought and actions, to philosophy and theology, psychology and sociology, biology, physics, history and politics, is all based on a completely erroneous premise, and is headed wildly, blithely, obviously off in the wrong direction. Only in non-action can anything meaningful happen. This is the meaning of Krishna's admonition in the Bhagavad Gita. To be awake to what the world is asleep to, and asleep to what the world is awake to. Being quiet in stillness, doing nothing, aware, is the only thing that is not wasting time. Wait, how about the unconscious? The unconscious what? What is called the unconscious mind, the unconscious self. This is what I mean by everything being based on a mistaken premise. Once you accept the widely held but unfounded belief in an individual self and an individual mind, you can then go to work and subdivide that mind into any number of conscious and subconscious and unconscious and superconscious parts and develop whole sciences to deal with each of them. But you're heading pell-mell down a dead-end road with all that. It'll keep you and everyone you know occupied in the dream for many generations, but it will never lead anywhere. But when I work to uncover the unconscious reasons why I do things I do or feel the way I feel, this seems to be getting in touch with a level that is more real and more meaningful, the unconscious level, which is what drives and motivates this more superficial conscious level. Sure, And doing this kind of work can lead to a higher level of functioning of the body-mind organism, once the forces that are at work are understood. Yes, definitely. Yes, but this is all within the dream, within the construct of mind in which these phenomena of body-mind organisms and the individual self and mind divided into various levels all have apparent reality. In this dream, there are things experienced as pleasant and there are things experienced as painful. If there is a disturbed childhood in one of the dream characters, much of the later so-called life of that character may be unhappy. If there is going through successful therapy, maybe some of the rest of that life will be happier. There are many things in the dream which, if they happen, can make a part of the dream less unpleasant. If the character takes a cooking class, it may have the opportunity to enjoy better tasting foods than canned beans. If it takes a seminar and learns a new strategy or a new way of thinking or acting, the dream will be experienced in a new way that the dream character may like better. The world is full of ways to improve your experience of the dream, from the trivial to the deeply valuable and useful. But none have anything whatever to do with what we are talking about here. We are not talking about improving your experience of the dream. We are talking about seeing the dream for what it is, as a mental construct, a mind-generated fantasy, a projection of what is called the mind, but which in fact does not exist, either conscious or unconscious. What do you mean the mind doesn't exist? What mind? What is it that you are calling your mind? Well, I would probably agree that there isn't a thing called a mind. It's not an organ because I think it is throughout the body and not just in the brain, but it's the mind part of the body-mind organism. So instead of a thing, would you call the mind a function? Okay, the thinking function, the reasoning function, and more than that. There are intuitive and other things that happen subconsciously, so those are the mind too. I agree that there is functioning in these body-mind organisms. There is physical functioning and there is mental functioning. Physical functioning is experienced as bodily activity of various kinds. Mental functioning is experienced as thoughts and mental activity. And it is because of these activities what the Buddhist tradition calls skandhas, the thought processes, sensory perceptions, and so on, the functioning of the body-mind organism, that there is an assumption made that there is something, someone here doing these things. But that's an unfounded assumption. To perceive that the skandhas are empty of an individual self doing them is to awaken. All there is consciousness. There is the apparent functioning of consciousness in and through these apparent body-mind organisms, but they do not exist as separate entities as such. That's why we call this the dream. Everything, including the body-mind organism you call yourself, does not exist as something separate in itself, but only as an apparent functioning in consciousness. There is no separate self or mind, only dream characters in self or consciousness. There is only thinking happening in this apparent organism. In these dream characters, we experience this. We experience thoughts happening. But the assumption that they originate inside these heads in something we call a mind is an unwarranted leap. It's the basic misperception from which everything else, all of dualism, all of the illusion of separation, all samsara, follows. So what I'm saying right now, I'm not saying it isn't coming from this mind. Exactly. Okay, you keep calling this a dream. I understand the analogy. It's a simple one, really, but I don't see how it applies. The value of the dream analogy is that it gives a sense for how it is that physical reality, all of the consensus reality, is basically not real. but is also in a sense real. The analogy is how we think of our sleeping dreams. If you dreamed something at night when you were asleep, when you woke up, you wouldn't say that what happened in the dream really happened. It was only a dream. On the other hand, it was a real dream. If you are telling someone about a dream you actually had, you aren't lying or making it up. You really did have this dream. What we mean by saying that the dream isn't real, in the sense that consensus reality is real, is that the dream does not exist independently on its own the way it is believed other objects do. It exists only as a dream of the one who dreamt it. What I'm telling you is that this is the case for all of what you think of as reality, what we are calling consensus reality, what humanity generally agrees is real. It is not real, like you think it is. It exists only as a dream in consciousness. It has a certain reality to it, yes, it exists in a certain way. All there is consciousness, and this exists in consciousness as an expression of consciousness. So it does have a certain existence, but it does not exist on its own, independently. It is only here as an expression, a projection in consciousness. The ultimate dreamer, it does not have any existence other than that. Another similar analogy, which hasn't been around as long, is the hologram. A hologram is really only an illusion created by projecting a beam of coherent light. Yet a very sophisticated hologram would have the potential to look and sound and otherwise seem very real as physical reality, so that you could interact with the hologram of a person as if there were a real person there, which of course there wouldn't be. Yes, but a hologram wouldn't really seem real because it isn't substantial. You could put your hand through it or walk through it, for example. But that's why I say I don't see how it applies. I don't think you or that wall are dreams or holograms because they are very substantial. I can't walk through you. Exactly. So I ask you, under what circumstances would a hologram seem very substantial? Or put it another way, to whom would a hologram appear solid? Another hologram. Exactly. Take your time. I'm sorry, I seem to have lost my train of thought. Just stay with that for a while. Relax, don't try to struggle with it, just be still for a minute. Can you tell me what we are talking about? Advaita, non-duality. What was the last thing that was said before you lost your train of thought? I'm afraid I'm sort of blanked out there. That's fine. A little disoriented? Yeah, I'm okay, but that was definitely strange. Then, as a stranger bid it welcome, just stay with that disorientation a little before it slips away. Savor it. Get the feel of it. This is very beautiful. This is actually what you are looking for, without realizing it. The last thing that you said before blanking out was to recognize the possibility that all of this seems real only because you, yourself, aren't real either. You said that only another hologram would see holograms as substantial or real. The idea occurred to you that maybe you are only a hologram. Oh yeah. Now, if you really didn't take that as a serious possibility, that would have seemed like just an interesting idea and you would have breezed through it without any problem. But because of what's happening here, the ego, that constructed, built-up sense of an individual self, was faced with the real possibility that what you have always thought of as you, this mind-body apparatus operating in the world, does not exist in any true sense as anything real, but only as a hologram, a projection, a dream. And the ego is not able to deal with that, so it checks out. This is the difference between the intellectual understanding in which these ideas are tossed around and argued about, and the understanding going deeper. It goes to another level, where the ego, the sense of individual self, gets exploded, annihilated. No doubt that would be experienced as a bit disorienting, yes? The ego sense of self spends all its time trying to stay in control. And that means trying to keep you away from these moments of disorientation when the bottom drops out and it doesn't know what to do. This is so beautiful. This is what I mean when I talk about asking the dangerous question, the question that may end your life. This idea that this you is not real, is only a thought, a projection, stopped you. That's why I said to savor that feeling of disorientation. Get to know it, to not fear it, to welcome it. You'll be back there again. That place where the ego is completely disoriented is what you're looking for. The Zen practice of meditating on unsolvable koans, for example, is designed to get the ego mind to that place where it can't cope and blanks out. One day, instead of bouncing back from it, going back there to the familiar, you won't. You'll stay here, fall deeper, break through to the other side. Then you won't go back. Then you won't be there anymore. It'll be perfectly obvious that there isn't any mind, isn't any self, isn't any you, isn't any this side or other side, anything to go back to. That's what's called awakening. Of course, please don't go around trying to disorient yourself. There's the prescriptive and descriptive fallacy again. This is just the describing what happens, not something you can do. You can't cause it. Just welcome it when it comes. It sounds a little scary. Actually, I might lose my mind. You don't have a mind to lose. You'll just lose the mistaken idea that you have one. But scary, yes. That's the ego, the sense of being an individual self, reasserting itself and not wanting to go where it isn't in charge anymore. That's why I say sometimes that left to our own devices, no one would choose this. The ego can't choose its own annihilation. Fortunately, it's not up to you. We've all been conditioned to get scared at this point and worry about going insane. When you step beyond the boundaries of the almost universally accepted perimeters of the dream, of consensus reality, and thoughts happen that are really outside the box, outside of Plato's cave, then it is quite possible there may be some experience of psychological pain or turbulence. And also, everyone else still in the dream is going to think you are pretty weird. But trust me, the place that is really insane is where you are now, believing you are separate, not knowing your true nature, thinking you are this thing, not realizing you are all that is, the pure, choiceless awareness in which all this appears, being, consciousness, bliss, outpouring. Dreams within dreams. Nothing you can explain exists. Robert Adams. Consciousness is a singular of which the plural is unknown. Erwin Schrödinger. In these pages there is much use made of the analogy of the dream. To say that waking consciousness in the world appears as real in waking consciousness is actually more like a dream is to use a metaphor. It goes hand in hand with the metaphor of awakening, and both are used to point toward the understanding. But when taken literally, these images can take on a life of their own and lead to thoughts and questions about how one can wake up from the dream, which are nothing but an extended and rather pointless detour. In traditional Advaita, There is a conceptual distinction between three states or levels of consciousness, and then the consciousness which is above or beyond or prior to the other three, and which witnesses the three states of consciousness. The three states are the waking state, which is considered to be the least conscious state or the deepest stupor, the dreaming state, and the consciousness which is there in deep sleep, which ironically to most Westerners is considered to be the clearest, the purest, the most awake of the three. Then there is consciousness which perceives and experiences all three of these states, the consciousness in which all these three states, waking, dreaming, and deep sleep, arise. There is an inverse awareness here. The deeper one goes into what the West calls unconsciousness, the Advaita model sees as more conscious. What the West calls waking up, Advaita sees as becoming more unconscious. The Western model is so programmed into our thinking. The waking state is given such priority and value that the other states are valued only when they are interpreted in the context of waking consciousness. Thus, the Western psychological model is to make unconscious processes conscious, that is, recognized and interpreted by the waking consciousness. And the thought patterns that occur in dreaming consciousness are endlessly interpreted by the waking mind. The Advaita model would see this process as backwards, as dumbing down the higher levels of consciousness in a way that is amenable to the lowest level. This Advaita model of consciousness is examined by James Carse in Breakfast at the Victory, the Mysticism of Ordinary Experience. Carse is a professor of religion at New York University, and as far as I know, no relation. But with a name like that, who knows? In speaking of the consciousness in which waking, dreaming, and deep sleep arise, Carse points out, while this deep state is not directly known to the other levels of consciousness, each of those levels is perfectly known to it. In other words, self-knowledge is not knowing who or what the true self is. It is being known by the true self. Dreams and also other messages from what is called the unconscious or subconscious often seem very strange to the waking consciousness, precisely because they do not fit into waking reality. Waking consciousness then must interpret the dream to make sense of it in light of what it accepts as reality. This way, the dream becomes the property of the waking eye, and the deeper consciousness that was at work in it goes back into hiding. The usual way of interpreting a dream is to translate its concepts into terms familiar with the waking eye. If we follow the Hindus' insight into levels of consciousness, we would reverse this process. We would ask ourselves what the dreaming eye knows about the waking eye that the waking eye cannot know about itself. Please notice here that it is evident that Carse is thinking of the three levels of consciousness as states belonging to an individual self and is interpreting the Hindu or Advaita tradition accordingly. He even seems to refer to ultimate consciousness, all that is, as a fourth, deepest state of individual consciousness. Somewhat ironically, this is exactly the kind of analysis the waking state engages in to bring what seems like a strange but intriguing teaching into alignment with the waking state's beliefs. In this case, the belief in separate individuals, each with their own levels of consciousness. Nevertheless, the point of all this is that mutatis mutandis, there is a useful insight here. Remember Maharaj, the very idea of going beyond the dream is illusory. It is not for the waking consciousness to go anywhere. The waking consciousness is the dream character. It belongs in the dream. The dream is not your problem. Who you truly are is not the dream character, not the waking consciousness, not a state, not even a higher self of deeper but still individual consciousness. Rather, who you truly are is all that is, consciousness, the Absolute, in which the sleeping dream and the waking dream and the dreamlessness all appear. Consciousness, all that is, cannot be directly known by the waking consciousness you call yourself because it cannot be translated. It cannot become the property of this dream character. But you, the you that you think you are, is perfectly known to it. It is what you are. Trinity. I am presence, not I am present, or you are present, or he is present. When one sees the situation as it really is, that no individual is involved, that what is present is presence as a whole, then the moment this is perceived there is liberation. Nisargadatta Maharaj. Would you say that any feeling or emotion is consciousness appearing as that feeling? For example, anxiety or calmness. Or is it simply these feelings appearing in consciousness? The same question applies to thoughts. As I see it, anger or compassion is in essence no different than the pen I am using. Is this true? In a sense, it depends on how fine you want to split the atom, as it were. On the most basic or truest level, nothing is. Ramana Maharshi said, whatever is not there in deep sleep does not exist. All that is there in deep sleep is that original, primal awareness that is not even aware of its own awareness. What Maharaj refers to as your natural state. The Zen koan about what was your original face before you were born points to this. Before the body is born and identified consciousness arises, and again after it dies, you are unidentified consciousness, awareness, presence. Even during the so-called life of the body, you are not other than that, although the identification makes this hard to see. There is nothing other than this awareness. Thoughts occur in this awareness. Automobiles occur in this awareness. Nebulae occur, dreams occur, memories occur, accidents occur, emotions occur. When asked if the gods of Hindu mythology were real, Ramana Maharshi said they are as real as this world. Myth and the physical world are equally real. Feelings, thoughts, and pens have the same reality, the same unreality. The physicists tell us that when you look closely enough, physical reality is not material at all, but immaterial energy. The concept I sometimes try to express is that the basic building block of what we experience around us, including ourselves and the worlds of material things and energies and thoughts, is what is referred to as Ananda, in the Hindu expression Satchitananda. The Sanskrit word Ananda is most usually translated bliss, so people get a funny idea about it. But there is something much bigger happening with this, and sometimes there are attempts to talk about this, but it is extremely difficult to have it come out making any sense. In the concept of Satchitananda, there is a parallel with the Christian mystical theology of the Trinity. Both agree that first is the origin, the unmoved source, being itself. Consciousness at rest, awareness, being, Sat, the Father. Then, in some inexpressible way, there is a stirring, a movement, a breath, a turning, a reflecting something of this sense within this original, unmoved all that is. This is the Logos, consciousness reflected, which is itself not other than the same awareness. It is consciousness, now aware of itself, yet not other than or separate from pure awareness. Chit, the sun. It is perhaps the intelligence, awakeness aspect of awareness. The beginning of John's Gospel, in the beginning was the Word, Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and it was there in the beginning with God, is struggling with this same inexpressible. So there's that. But then there's something else, even more inexpressible. Both Hindu and Christian traditions see that there is somehow something conceptually more. In Christianity, this more is called the Spirit of God, which is sometimes described or defined as the love between the Father and the Son. So, not something really separate, but the love that occurs in this movement, breath, stirring of awareness. A love so complete that it is itself, not other than God. This is pure love, natural, unidentified. The nature of this love is that it cannot be contained, and it pours out of itself in itself, what I call the outpouring. It spills out, overflows as it were. This love is unimaginable, and there is hesitation to refer to it even as love. It is fierce, power, intensity, peace, glory, burning brilliance, completely and totally overwhelming to the human experience and the human capacity to comprehend. Ananda is as pathetically inadequate a word as love, and both the Christian and Hindu traditions are quite clear that this Ananda, or spirit, or love, is not something other than God, being, consciousness. God or Brahman is one. Father, Son, Spirit, or Sat Chit Ananda are just three concepts being thrown together in an attempt to triangulate on what is. All of this is conceptual, the mind struggling and stretching to comprehend. There is no absolute truth in these concepts and expressions. They are only perhaps useful pointers. When Maharaj made his cryptic comment about everything being made out of love, the whole manifestation existing and being sustained by and in and as this primal, absolute love, this is what he was saying. This outpouring of Ananda, God, bliss, beauty, love, gratitude, intensity, power, spirit, stillness, perfection, brilliance, is energy. The only energy there is. It is all there is. It is the energy the physicists are detecting when they look at the subatomic particles and detect not matter, but an energetic explosion. Part of the vision in the jungle was the seeing of this energy as outpouring from the source, and even this concept they glimpse at the inexpressible and streaming, showering as this. What is experienced here is this world, thoughts and diesel engines and anxiety and frogs and smoke and daydreams and sidewalks. This is what I am trying to express here. God or love or Ananda or spirit is precisely the stuff that all of this is made out of, which is why this is not other than that. It is that. It is made of that. Another way to think of the Sat-Chit-Ananda Trinity is to realize that all there is consciousness, Chit. Consciousness at rest in stillness is Sat. Consciousness in motion, in activity, outpouring, is Ananda. It's all the same. It's all one. So this is your essence, or all that is. It can only be all that is if it is all there is. If all there is it. So anything which looks like something else isn't. It's it. So there's Tony Parsons, for example, pointing to a cushion thrown on the floor and saying, "This is it." That's the whole message. The Buddhist concept of all sentient beings is meant to be inclusive, honoring all sentient beings, working for the deliverance of all sentient beings. But in fact it is incomplete and exclusive. It's anthropocentric. We honor sentient beings because we recognize that in their sentience they are like us. What of trees? Blades of grass, specks of dust, molecules of water, this bit of mud, dirt, stone, steel, petroleum, plastic. It has already long been everything and always is everything. When there's talking about samsara or illusion, it's not that there's nothing there. There's all there is there. The illusion is in perceiving it as separate material stuff, which it isn't. It's God, love, Ananda. It just looks like stuff. Anger, pen, cat, prayer, solstice, hummingbird, death, scrambled eggs. To identified consciousness, the body-mind organisms who think they are somebody living a life in a world. This is what's going on in the Christian mystical tradition when there's all the talk about the love of God being this fierce refiner's fire that burns everything away. This is misunderstood as some vengeful God thing, but those who originally saw it saw this. When the outpouring is apperceived, seen, understood, nothing of this human experience can stand it. Everything is burned up, gone. None of this, only that love which is all that is outpouring presence. Is. It looks like slush, spraying off the wheels of a car in the city in January. It looks like a husband being sent to serve in Afghanistan. It looks like a friend's cancer or failing heart, or a mother hugging her child, or my old sneakers or my ballpoint. But here it obviously isn't. Nobody sees it, but it's obviously perfect, brilliant stillness, outpouring. Finally, interestingly enough, both the Christian and Hindu traditions recognize that neither Satchitananda nor Father, Son, Spirit are the Absolute. Both are only as far as the human mind can stretch, as close as it can come to comprehending what cannot be comprehended. Satchitananda is an attempt to describe Brahman, which itself arises from Para-Brahman, that which is beyond Brahman. Father, Son, and Spirit describe the triune God, which arises from the Godhead beyond God. All in all, it's a remarkable parallel, an element of the perennial wisdom at work in two very different traditions. Okay, so there's that. But so what? You can't talk about what cannot be comprehended. You can't teach burned up. As long as it has not been apperceived, it makes no sense, or at best it's only concepts, more ideas. When it is apperceived, there is no need. So there's a valid argument. And there are teachers saying that there's no point in splitting the atom so fine. So, all there is God. But how does that help the average person or the average seeker? It doesn't seem to. They're frustrated. So there is often the developing of a teaching to help them live this dream better. Osho, Dafri, John, Ramesh, Robert Adams come to mind as only a few of the well-meaning teachers who start out with a radical message but over time dilute it into principles and stages and practices, and in some cases even insipid, little inspirational daily reminders when people don't understand or respond to the pure, simple teaching. And of course the Buddhist tradition as a whole, beautiful as it is infamous for institutionalizing this kind of thing. Ken Wilber has even given a theoretical basis for this, saying that those in whom there is a clear seeing and knowing of what is actually have an obligation to come up with a less radical version that the typical seeker can comprehend. Here it's different. There are now, always have been, always will be, plenty of versions and variations readily available of methods for living, for how to improve yourself, how to raise the level of functioning of the separate self, how to feel better in daily life. There are millions of teachers able and willing to teach these methods. On the other hand, there are apparently few who see what is. There is arguably some benefit in having the few who do see say what only they can say. How can there be concern about how many can understand this or even comprehend or appreciate it? That is not the point, not the purpose. Help in daily living is available in many flavors and varieties. That is not the functioning here. Does the expression of this understanding help individuals or confuse them? There is no knowing, and there is little energy spent agonizing over the question. That is being taken care of in ways we cannot know. That, like everything else in the dream, is not my problem. There is no intention here. All that can be done is here to say what is known. Things are not as they seem. None of this matters. There is no you, no me. There are no individuals as separate entities. There is no home. Always, everywhere, perfect, brilliant stillness. And no thing, which has no name. Love and compassion and bliss are inadequate shadow words, outpouring constantly. Clear, perfect love, infinite presence, and seen here, now, always. Not seen as from this mind-body thing, but as from that same stillness, that presence which is all that is, perhaps through or as this mind-body instrument. For this stillness, this presence, is what I is. Amen. Svaha.